Hello and welcome back to My Friend the Rainbow Circle. A few episodes ago, I talked about the great opening lines of books that inspired me, and I didn't have my Thomas Hardy books with me, but I referenced The Fixer. I think between The Fixer and Return of the Native, both of them taught me a lot about structure, but with Return of the Native, um, taught me a lot about opening the structure that it taught me a lot about was opening the book, because most of the beginning of it is really just description. It's just scene setting, just description of the scene, um, which is much more common in 19th century novels. I think when I first read it, I might not have been aware of that. But Thomas Hardy, I've read a big chunk of his novels. I haven't read that enough really in 19th century. He was 19th century, early 20th century, I realized, um, but I haven't read enough 19th century novels, and I think, the thing about the false universal definitions of good and bad, everybody resonates with writers differently. So of the 19th century writers, he's just the one that, for whatever reason, whatever irrational reason, I resonated with the most. Um, I love other 19th century novels, but they just didn't resonate as deeply with me as Thomas Hardy did, just for whatever reason. But what I tend to do is when I get somebody I love, I read all of that person, like Kurt Vonnegut I talked about before. I try to read all of that person, sometimes to the exclusion of other writers. Unfortunately, that's just a bad habit I'm in. Um, so I've read most of these, with the exception of a few. Um, they don't all have just amazing opening lines. If you read it, and that's a 19th century tendency, is to be much more verbose and much more wordy. And I think that relates to a lot of my problems with how people will teach prose in the workshop system. There's a favoring of efficiency as the only possible good, as the solitary universal good. Efficiency is fine and all, but it's not the only good thing you could possibly do. It's something that was trendy when during the rise of the workshop system, and so it sort of got stuck in the workshop system. But verbosity was very trendy in the 19th century. Is one better than the other? No, not at all. It's just whatever is popular at the time. So, certainly a lot of the Thomas Hardy stuff, you look at the second and third line and you get a lot of what really resonates about openings of books. But just to go back to what I said in the previous episode, what's really effective in an opening of a book, and not every great book is going to have a great opening, but what really works in a great opening is, I would say, setting up the parataxis at the beginning, or setting up elision, something that you as the reader want to fill in the blanks, or parataxis, just juxtaposing things that don't seem to belong together. And what drives you through the text is a desire to resolve that tension. So it sets up some sort of tension at the beginning, whether it's filling in a blank or, resolving how things are connected, or something like that. But it can also just create a setting or a mood. And Return of the Native, and just right at the beginning, does that too. So it might not set up the tension to drive the whole thing, but it sets up the tension that's just subtextual and intrinsic just to the nature of the place itself. So of all the Thomas Hardy opening lines, this is one of the better ones. A Saturday afternoon in November was approaching, the time at twilight, and the vast tract of unenclosed wild known as Egdon Heath embrowned itself moment by moment. So, it's setting up Egdon Heath. It's setting up just the tension of darkness approaching. And this line too. Overhead, the hollow stretch of white. The second line. Overhead, the hollow stretch of whitish cloud shutting out the sky was as a tent, which had the whole heath for its floor. So the whole idea of this very wild place, and the whole opening chapter sets up, it's very wild, very chaotic, very tangled, very full of life. So it has a lot of these paradoxes just intrinsic to it. It's wild. It's full of life. It's covered in darkness. It's open. It's closed. It's bright. It's dark. Um, so it sets up a lot of the tensions of the whole book. And part of what it taught me about structure um, is Clem Yeobright doesn't really show up till much later. So the native of the title character doesn't show up till much later. Um, so really my favorite Thomas Hardy book, that's my favorite opening line, but my favorite Thomas Hardy book is Jude the Obscure, of course. The opening line is not his best opening line. It works. It works. The schoolmaster was leaving the village, and everybody seemed sorry. Certainly sets the mood. It's a book about being sorry. It's a book about schoolmasters being very valuable. And then it goes into, and he's not the main character. He's not Jude, but he inspires Jude. Jude shows up really on the second page. The boy Jude assisted the loading of some small articles. But everybody loves this schoolmaster. It's not really obvious just from the line, but it's certainly reading the book, you can recognize that being a schoolmaster, being an academic, being educated becomes this really, really important thing. That's the tension that really drives the whole book, as Jude is inspired to be an academic, but he comes from this very, very humble beginning. Hold on. Tess is a prime example. I have so many friends who hate this book, and I love Tess. I think Tess is just a fascinating, complicated character, but I have a lot of feminist friends who hate it, and it's a fascinating study of just the response to it based on its approach to gender. But I think Tess herself is, sure, problematic, but also fascinating in many ways. But it starts with her father, and that's just, Thomas Hardy does that a lot. He starts with a character who prompts the whole thing, drives the whole thing eventually, and you don't quite know yet, and then it gets to the main character a little later. But it starts with her father. On an evening in the latter part of May, a middle-aged man was walking homeward from Shaston to the village of Marlet in the adjoining vale of Blackmore. Blackmore gives two different spellings, and that becomes a real important plot point. So a lot of that, you don't quite get the significance of it until later. And really the second line, I think, communicates a lot about her father in some relevant ways. The pair of legs that carried him were rickety, and there was a bias in his gait which inclined him somewhat to the left of a straight line. So you get the idea, and a lot of this characterization of essentially a minor character, but he's the one just in this sequence that really sets up the whole thing. He's sort of wavering from the path. He's sort of stumbling and wavering. So he steps off of the path, and it's a book about stepping off of the path. He's poor, and he sort of gets inspired to connect with this rich part of his family. He thinks is a part of his family, and he gets Tess to do that, and she, gets forced into the soul situation. But anyway, it's setting the scene. It's setting up, the dynamics of a character who is sort of wavering from his path. The Mayor of Casterbridge, another really good one. And it does a similar sort of thing as Tess does. One evening of late summer before the 19th century had reached 1/3 of its span. Thomas Hardy does a lot of that kind of stuff that doesn't do much. I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing that, but he throws in a lot of details, dumps a lot of details right in the first part, but he's very verbose. That's just Thomas Hardy. But here's the meat of the opening line. A young man and woman, the latter carrying a child, were approaching the large village of Weydon Priors in Upper Wessex on foot. A lot of the times he's just referencing these villages and stuff like that. And that first line doesn't quite get the tension yet. It's just a man and a woman. But the second line gets a little better. They were plainly but not ill-clad, though the thick hoar of dust which had accumulated on their shoes and garments from an obviously long journey lent a disadvantageous shabbiness to their appearance just now. So disadvantageous, that's a really interesting word choice there. So this shabby couple, so it's somewhat similar to, Tessa's father just showing up right at the beginning. You get a sense that he's kind of quirky and he's kind of an unusual guy. Here you get, the main couple just right at the beginning, kind of shabby looking also. This is the Trumpet Major. This is one I haven't read. I've read most of them, but I haven't read this one yet. I haven't been doing my booktube duty. This is an edition that I really like of Jude. It's a nice looking edition. This is the sort of fake editions that companies will put out to look fancy, but I fall for it. I fall for it every time. It's not really an old edition. It's just a fakely fancy edition. But I like these Reader's Modern Library editions too. These are nice, just simple editions. This is Return of the Native. This is my test. I think it's the same. Oh, Modern Library. Anyway, this is not a great edition of this book. It's kind of a shabby edition, shabby cheap edition. But not doing my booktube duty. I'm showing off the editions. But I like this opening line. I just haven't gotten around to reading this one yet. This is the Trumpet Major. The Trumpet Major. In the days of high-waisted and muslin-gowned women, when the vast amount of soldiering going on in the country was a cause of much trembling to the sex, there lived in a village near the Wessex coast 2 ladies of good report, though unfortunately of limited means. That's an interesting opening line. The elder was Mrs. Martha Garland, a landscape painter's widow, and the other was her only daughter, Anne. So, yeah, that's an interesting one. It sets up a lot of tension. It's, it maybe is loading up too much. I mean, Thomas Hardy's style is that he goes a little bit more slowly through things than is the fashion today. When the vast amount of soldiering going on in the country was a cause of much trembling of the sex, there lived in the village ladies of good report, though unfortunately of limited means. And that seems, certainly inspired by Jane Austen type of opening line. But anyway, I also have this one. This is a nice Penguin edition. Nice looking cover. The other ones really don't have much of a cover, but this one has a nice cover. This is a series of short stories. These don't really have great opening lines, necessarily. A mere interlude. The traveler in schoolbooks who vouched in driest tones for the fidelity to fact of the following narrative used to add a ring of truth to it by opening with a nicety of criticism on the heroine's personality. So very verbose and not the most stylish. I mean, certainly with Return of the Native, that's much more indication of the style that is really appealing about Thomas Hardy. This is an imaginative woman. When William Marchmill had finished his inquiries for lodgings at the well-known watering place of Sea in Upper Wessex, he returned to the hotel to find his wife. Kind of a boring opening line. But yeah, I think something that works with Tess's establishment of characterization. Mayor of Casterbridge, you do get some, pretty substantial indication of characterization, what the conflict might end up being. Return of the Native, even though it's really about the setting, it still gives you that pretty good indication of the intensity of the tone of the nature itself being, full of so many contradictions that are really reflected in the characters as well. And Jude, my favorite one, that one is kind of one that works more. Once you know the story, it's much clearer what the conflict is. You don't quite get, some indication of the conflict until later. So, it doesn't really reflect just the quality of the books necessarily. Like The Trumpet Major is not one that I hear much about. But it is a really intriguing opening line that kind of makes me want to read more. Whereas Jude the Obscure, easily my favorite. I don't know if I just read that opening line that I would necessarily want to read the whole thing. Um, you know, who's the school teacher? I don't care that much. But knowing the whole story, it is a really intense and fascinating opening line for sure. It's a really, really important opening line. But anyway, so that's how opening lines can work really effectively. But you don't always have to have just an amazing, perfect opening line. You can have a great book without that. But anyway, I'll see you on the next episode. Maybe with some more opening lines, just for fun.